AITA for refusing to leave my own house after my husband secretly invited his estranged, unstable mother to move into our mother-in-law's suite permanently. The silence in my kitchen at 3 in the morning has a distinct weight to it. It's the kind of quiet that only exists after a massive storm. The kind where you can still hear the phantom rattling of the windows long after the wind has died down. I sat at the kitchen island, the cold quartz chilling my forearms, staring out the window at the detached structure across our courtyard. The lights inside the mother-in-law suite were blazing, casting a sharp clinical glow across the manicured grass of our backyard. Inside that suite was Eleanor, and inside our main house, sleeping soundly in our bedroom, was my husband, Mark. To understand how a 36-year-old woman ends up feeling like a hostage in a home she pays more than half the mortgage for, you have to understand that Mark has always carried a ghost. When I met him a decade ago, he was a self-made man who had completely severed ties with his mother. Eleanor was the definition of an unstable parent, deeply manipulative, financially parasitic, and prone to sudden, explosive disappearances that left a young Mark to fend for himself. For the first 8 years of our relationship, she didn't exist. Mark had done the hard work of therapy, built a successful career in logistics, and became the incredibly gentle, protective father our 7-year-old daughter, Maya, adores. I thought the monster under his bed had been thoroughly vanquished. Then, 6 months ago, Eleanor resurfaced. She didn't call with an apology. She called from a county hospital caseworker's office. She had suffered a series of microstrokes that left her with mild cognitive decline, no savings, and an eviction notice from her dilapidated apartment in Phoenix. Mark was shattered. The childhood programming rewired itself overnight. Suddenly, the mother who had abandoned him was a frail, vulnerable old woman who needed her son. I supported him through the emotional whiplash. I helped him research assisted living facilities, offered to contribute to her medical care, and held him while he cried out years of pent-up resentment. What I did not do was consent to her moving onto our property. We bought this house 2 years ago specifically for the detached cottage. I am a freelance graphic novelist and book illustrator. That space was my sanctuary, my studio, and the place where I kept my professional life alive while raising Maya. Mark knew what that studio meant to me. Yet, yesterday afternoon, I pulled into our driveway after taking Maya to a weekend birthday party to find a commercial moving truck blocking our cul-de-sac. 2 men were unloading boxes of worn, floral-patterned furniture into my studio. When I walked inside, breathless and confused, I found Mark standing in the center of my cleared-out workspace. Beside him sat Eleanor in a wheelchair, looking frail, but wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mark looked at me, his face pale and strained, and said, "Nora, please don't make a scene." She had nowhere else to go. It's already done. He had quietly signed a long-term care agreement, altered our property insurance, and had his cousins move my entire studio, my drafting tables, my archives, my life's work, into a damp commercial storage unit downtown while I was gone for 4 hours. He didn't just cross a boundary, he completely erased the map we had built our marriage on. When I demanded to know how long she was staying, Eleanor sighed dramatically, patted Mark's hand, and murmured, "I told you, Marky, I'm just a burden. Put me in a shelter." Mark shot me a look of pure, defensive fury and whispered, "She's staying permanently, Nora. She's my mother. I'm not letting her die on the street." Now the weight of that betrayal is suffocating. I spent the night on the living room sofa because looking at Mark made me physically ill. He bypassed our partnership, weaponized his trauma, and gave away my livelihood to a woman who spent his childhood tearing him down. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I heard the floorboards creak behind me. Mark walked into the kitchen, his hair disheveled, holding 2 coffee mugs. He looked exhausted, but his jaw was set in that stubborn line I've come to dread. "We need to talk," he said quietly, setting a mug down in front of me. "And you need to be reasonable about this." The sheer audacity of the word reasonable sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins. I looked up at him, my voice completely devoid of the warmth we had shared for 10 years. "Reasonable, Mark? You systematically dismantled my career space, brought a toxic stranger into our home, and lied to me for months. Tell me exactly what part of that requires my cooperation." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "She was going to be evicted onto the streets, Nora. Her health is failing. Yes, I should have told you, but I knew you'd say no. I knew you'd analyze the finances and the legalities and find a reason to block it. Sometimes family means doing what's right instead of what's convenient." "This isn't about convenience, it's about respect," I replied, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "You didn't just invite her here? You took my space. Where am I supposed to work? How are we supposed to protect Maya from the volatile behavior you spent a decade warning me about?" "She's changed," Mark insisted, stepping closer, his eyes pleading. "The strokes, they took the edge off her. She's quiet now. She just wants peace. And as for your work, we can set up a desk in the guest bedroom. It's temporary until we can figure out a better flow." "You just said she was staying permanently," I pointed out, the trap snapping shut. Mark hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window facing the cottage. "Permanently just means we aren't putting a clock on it. Look, Nora, my family is already calling me a hero for stepping up. My sister, my aunts, they all think this is the right thing to do. If you cause a scene now, if you make her leave, you're going to look like the villain. Is that really who you want to be? The heartless wife who kicked a sick old woman out?" I stared at my husband, realizing with a sinking heart that he had planned this entirely to corner me. He knew that by the time I found out, the social pressure from his extended family and his own emotional manipulation would make it nearly impossible for me to fight back without looking fucking cruel. He was testing my compliance. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from an unknown number. I picked it up and read the words. "Thank you for sharing your lovely home, Nora. Mark promised me you wouldn't mind making a few sacrifices for family. I look forward to us becoming very close." A cold chill washed over me. I looked out the window just in time to see the curtain in the cottage window twitch shut. Eleanor wasn't changes at all. She was already playing the game, and my husband had just handed her the keys to our kingdom. The text message burned in my mind for the rest of the morning. I didn't show it to Mark. A strange, survivalist instinct told me to keep my cards close to my chest, especially now that I realized my husband was no longer operating as my partner, but as Eleanor's protector. By noon, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from tense silence to an agonizingly performative normalcy. Mark spent the morning setting up a small, cramped desk in our guest bedroom, trying to present it as a peace offering. He brought up a few of my sketchbooks from the garage, placing them neatly on the surface. When I walked past the room and saw the pathetic setup, a tiny corner squeezed between a twin bed and a closet, meant to replace a 600-square-foot light-filled studio, I felt a profound sense of mourning. He truly didn't understand what he had stolen from me. Or worse, he did understand and decided my worth was the acceptable casualty. "See?" Mark said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he emerged from the guest room. "It's cozy. It'll work for now, right? Maya is staying at my mother's house until Tuesday," I said, ignoring his question entirely. "I don't want her around this until we have clear ground rules." Mark's face hardened. "She's her grandmother, Nora. Maya has a right to know her." "Maya has a right to a stable environment," I countered, keeping my voice low and dangerous. "You spent 10 years telling me stories about how Eleanor would lock you out of the apartment when she was angry, or how she would spend the grocery money on lottery tickets and leave you with nothing but sleep for dinner. I am not exposing our daughter to that version of reality until I am certain it's gone." "She's in a wheelchair, Nora. She can barely walk to the bathroom without assistance." "What exactly do you think she's going to do to Maya?" Mark yelled, his control finally cracking. As if on cue, the intercom system we had installed in the cottage chirped. Mark had linked it to his phone, but he had also plugged a receiver into our kitchen. Eleanor's voice came through, thin, reedy, and laced with a terrifying frailty. "Marky, I'm sorry to bother you, sweetheart. The television isn't working, and I can't seem to find my blood pressure medication. I'm feeling a bit dizzy." Mark shot me a triumphant, punishing look. "See? She needs me," his eyes said. Without another word to me, he turned on his heel and jogged out the back door, crossing the courtyard to her rescue. I stood in the kitchen, watching him through the window. I watched him enter the cottage, his shoulders hunched with the familiar weight of a golden child trying to fix a broken world. I felt a wave of profound loneliness. 10 years of building a life, of sharing a bed, of whispering our deepest fears to each other in the dark, and it took less than 24 hours for him to revert to the traumatized boy who would sacrifice anything to keep his mother happy. I needed to see my space. I needed to see what was left of it. I walked out the back door, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I didn't knock on the cottage door. It was my property, after all. I opened it quietly and stepped into the entryway. The smell hit me instantly. Stale cigarettes masked by cheap lavender air freshener, a scent that felt violently invasive in a space that used to smell like linseed oil, fresh paper, and jasmine tea. The main room of the studio had been transformed. My beautiful oak drafting table had been pushed into the corner, covered by a knitted afghan. In its place stood a hospital bed and a massive, oversized recliner. Eleanor was sitting in the recliner, holding a cup of tea. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. The frail, dizzy woman who had just spoken over the intercom vanished, replaced by someone entirely alert. "Nora," she said, her voice smooth, lacking the tremor she used for Mark. "I was wondering when you'd come say hello properly." "You need to leave, Eleanor," I said, staying near the door, refusing to step further into the space she had claimed. "I don't know what lies Mark told you or what promises he made, but this is my place of business. You cannot stay here." Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes tracking me with a terrifying, calculated stillness. "Mark told me you'd be difficult. He said you were rigid, but he also told me that he owns exactly half of this dirt, and he's the one who signs the checks for the upkeep. He wants me here, Nora. He needs to make up for the years we lost. Surely a good, loving wife wouldn't deny her husband his salvation." The psychological warfare was so overt it almost made me laugh. "He doesn't sign the checks alone. And you aren't his salvation, Eleanor. You're his wound." Her eyes flashed with a sudden, vicious spark of anger, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Careful, girl, he's my son. He came from my blood. You're just a contract he signed. When push comes to shove, who do you think he's going to protect? The woman who demands he abandon his sick mother, or the mother who needs him?" Before I could respond, the bathroom door opened and Mark walked out, holding a bottle of pills. He stopped dead when he saw me standing there, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Nora, what are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice defensive. Eleanor's face instantly crumpled. Her lower lip trembled, and she shrank back into her recliner, looking suddenly 80 years old. "Marky, please don't be mad at her. Nora was just explaining to me that I'm making the house smell bad and that I'm ruining her work. I'll leave, honey. Just give me a blanket and put me in the car. I don't want to cause trouble between you two." Mark's face flushed red with instant, unvarnished rage. He turned to me, his chest heaving. "Get out, Nora. Get out of here right now." I looked at my husband, then at the triumphant glint in Eleanor's eyes behind his back. I realized then that this wasn't just a disagreement about a mother-in-law suite. This was a war for our life, and Mark had already surrendered his weapons to the the enemy. I turned around and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, knowing that the next move I made would determine whether I survived this marriage or was utterly destroyed by it. The following morning brought a tactical escalation that I wasn't prepared for. I woke up to the sound of my phone blowing up with notifications. When I checked the screen, I felt a sickening drop in my stomach. Mark's sister Chloe had posted a public essay on Facebook. It featured a picture of Mark pushing Eleanor in her wheelchair through our garden, captioned with a long, paragraph-steep tribute to the selflessness of a true son. But it was the subtext that cut like a knife. In a world full of selfish people who only care about their own space and their own careers, I am so proud of my brother for standing up for our mother when others wanted to cast her aside. True family doesn't put conditions on love. Thank you, Mark, for showing what real compassion looks like, even when it's uncomfortable for those around you. The comments were already flooded with praise from extended family members, old family friends, and neighbors. An angel. So proud of you, Mark. What an inspiration. I sat up in bed staring at the screen, realizing exactly how deep the trap had been dug. Mark hadn't just brought his mother here. He had mobilized an entire echo chamber to ensure that if I fought back, my reputation would be entirely demolished. They were painting me as the heartless, career-obsessed wife before I had even uttered a single word in my own defense. Mark walked into the bedroom, already dressed for work in a sharp navy suit. He looked at me, saw the phone in my hand, and looked away guilty. "Did you know Chloe was going to post that?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "She's just proud of me, Nora," he said, adjusting his watch. "She knows how hard this has been on me. Why does everything have to be an attack on you?" "Because it is an attack on me, Mark. She is literally calling me selfish for wanting to keep my own workspace and have a say in who lives on my property. Did you tell her you cleared out my studio without my permission?" "I told her we were making adjustments," Mark said, his voice rising as he stepped toward the door. "I don't have time for this right now. I have a management meeting across town. Just please, try to be civil today. Eleanor's nurse is coming at 10 to do an assessment. Just let her in." "A nurse? We're hiring private care now? With what money, Mark?" "With our money, Nora. She's my mother," he yelled, slamming the door behind him. The house shuddered with the impact, leaving me alone with the echo of his anger. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. If Mark was going to use social engineering and financial ambushes, I needed to understand exactly what legal ground I was standing on. I called an old friend from college, a real estate and family law attorney named Rachel. We met at a quiet coffee shop 15 minutes away from my house. When I laid out the situation, the joint deed on the house, the fact that the detached suite was permitted as part of the primary residence, and the fact that Mark had moved her in without a mutual agreement, Rachel's face grew incredibly grave. "Nora, legally, because he is a co-owner, he has the right to invite guests onto the property," Rachel explained, stirring her coffee. "However, establishing permanent residency is a different ballgame. If she stays there long enough to receive mail, get a driver's license registered there, or if he signs a formal care lease, she becomes a tenant. If you ever want her out, you'd have to formally evict her, which can take months and cost thousands, especially with her medical status." "He already signed a care agreement," I whispered, the weight of it crushing my chest. "He told me he signed a long-term care agreement with her caseworker." Rachel stopped stirring, her eyes locked onto mine. "Did he sign it as an individual, or did he sign it using joint funds or on behalf of the household? Because if he committed joint marital assets without your signature, he's in breach of fiduciary duty to the marriage. But more importantly, Nora, if this environment becomes hostile, you have options. You could leave and file for a partition sale of the home to force him to sell it and split the equity." "Leave?" I looked at her, a visceral reaction rising inside me. "Leave my own home? The house I picked out? The yard I planted for Maya? Why should I be the one to pack a bag and hide in a rental while the woman who ruined his childhood gets to sit in my studio and reap the benefits of my hard work?" "I'm not saying you should," Rachel said gently, reaching across the table to touch my hand, "but you need to realize what you're fighting. You aren't just fighting an unstable old lady. You're fighting a husband who is deeply deep in a trauma response cycle. He is willing to sacrifice you to earn the love of a woman who never gave it to him. If you stay in that house, you are going to be subjected to immense psychological warfare. Are you strong enough for that?" "I am not leaving my house," I said, each word feeling like stone. "If she wants a war, she can have one. But I'm not running away." I drove back home with a fiery determination. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a strange car parked out front, a beat-up sedan with Arizona plates. It wasn't a nurse's car. I walked into the house through the front door, keeping my footsteps quiet. As I passed the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the living room. I paused in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He's completely wrapped around my finger, Chloe," Eleanor's voice chuckled, clear as a bell, completely devoid of the reedy, frail tremor she used with Mark. "He's so desperate for me to say I'm proud of him that he'd throw that stuck-up bitch out on her ear if I asked him to. She thinks she's so smart with her drawings and her corporate rules. She doesn't know who she's dealing with." I peeked around the corner. Eleanor wasn't in her wheelchair. She was standing perfectly straight by our fireplace, holding one of my grandmother's antique porcelain vases, examining it with a cold, greedy eye. And sitting on our sofa, recording something on her laptop, was Mark's sister, Chloe. "Just keep playing the sick card, Mom," Chloe said, looking up from her screen with a smirk. "Nora's already losing her mind. I've got the whole family primed to destroy her if she tries anything. By the time we're done, Mark will file for divorce, you'll get the cottage, and we'll take half the equity of this place as a settlement for your care. She won't won't know what hit her. I stood in the shadow of the hallway, my phone in my hand, the voice memo app quietly recording every single word. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. It wasn't just an influx of an elderly mother. It was a coordinated asset grab designed to dismantle my life from the inside out. My hands were remarkably steady as I stopped the recording and saved the file under 3 different secure cloud accounts. I stepped back down the hallway, exited through the front door quietly, and then re-entered, intentionally slamming it shut to announce my arrival. By the time I walked into the living room, the transformation was seamless. Eleanor was back in her wheelchair, her blanket tucked around her legs, her eyes vacant and heavy-lidded. Chloe was smoothing down her skirt, her face morphing from an arrogant smirk to a mask of polite, patronizing pity. "Oh, Nora, you're home," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just flew in from Phoenix this morning. I came straight over to help Mom get settled since you've been so overwhelmed." I looked at Chloe, then at Eleanor. The level of sociopathic precision in this room was breathtaking. "Chloe, I didn't realize you were visiting. Mark didn't mention it." "Well, Mark has a lot on his plate dealing with everything alone," Chloe said, casting a pointed look around my clean, beautiful living room. "I just wanted to make sure Mom was safe. We're so grateful you've decided to be accommodating. It must be so hard for you to lose your little hobby space, but family comes first, right? Hobby space." The deliberate insult hit exactly where she wanted it to, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a flinch. "I'm going to go unpack some of Mom's things in the suite," Chloe continued, standing up and patting Eleanor's shoulder. "Mom, do you need anything before I go out there?" "Just my tea, sweetie," Eleanor whimpered, her voice trembling beautifully. "Nora, dear, would you mind bringing me a warm cup of chamomile? My joints are aching so terribly today." "Of course, Eleanor," I said, forcing a smile that felt like glass. "I'll bring it right out." I waited until Chloe had walked out the back door toward the cottage before I turned to Eleanor. The old woman looked up at me, a tiny mocking smile playing at the corners of her lips. She thought she had won. She thought I was broken. "You play the part well," I said quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I play to win, darling," she whispered back, the frail act dropping entirely. "Mark will be home in an hour. Make sure that tea is hot." I didn't make the tea. Instead, I sat down at the dining table and waited for my husband to come home. When Mark walked through the door at 5:30, he looked instantly defensive, bracing for another argument. But I didn't yell. I didn't demand anything. I simply stood up and handed him my phone with a pair of headphones. "What is this?" he asked, looking suspicious. "Just listen to it, Mark. All the way through," I said. He frowned, putting the headphones in, and pressed play. I watched his face closely. For the first 30 seconds, he looked confused. Then, as his mother's voice came through the speakers, clear, vibrant, and boasting about how she had him wrapped around her finger, I watched the color completely drain from his skin. When Chloe's voice detailed the plan to drive us to divorce and strip the equity from our home to fund their lives, Mark's hands began to shake so violently that he dropped the phone onto the table. He stared at the device as if it were a live grenade. The silence that followed was suffocating. They didn't mean it like that," he stammered, his voice cracking, his mind desperately trying to rationalize the horrific betrayal he had just heard. "Mom's confused, Nora. She's sick. She says things to please Chloe because Chloe is unstable." "Stop it, Mark," I said, my voice cutting through his delusions like a scalpel. "Stop defending the wolves at our door. She is not confused. She is not sick in the way she's telling you. She is actively, maliciously plotting with your sister to destroy your marriage and take your money. They are using your childhood trauma as a weapon against your wife and daughter." Mark sank into a dining chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, ragged sob escaped his throat. The illusion he had built, the fantasy of finally being the heroic son who earned his mother's love, had just been obliterated by the raw truth. "She doesn't love me," he whispered into his palms, the raw agony of a broken child finally breaking through the adult facade. "She never did. It was all a lie." I felt a pang of profound empathy for him in that moment. He was my husband and I loved him. But as I looked at him weeping, I also realized that his weakness had put our daughter's future in jeopardy. I couldn't afford to just be a comforting wife right now. I had to be a protector. "Mark," I said gently, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. "I am sorry for the pain this causes you, truly. But we have a daughter to think about. Your mother and sister are on our property right now, planning our ruin. We need to act, and we need to act now." He looked up, his eyes red and swollen, looking completely hollowed out. "What do you want to do?" "We are going to give them an ultimatum," I said, "but we have to do it legally, and we have to do it tonight." Before we could even stand up, the front door clicked open. It wasn't Chloe. It was my mother arriving with Maya. My daughter ran into the house, laughing, holding a drawing she had made at her grandmother's. "Mommy! Daddy!" Maya cheered, running toward us. But before she could reach us, the back door opened and Chloe walked in, followed by Eleanor, who was wheeling herself forward with an expression of sudden, intense panic. She must have realized Mark was home early. "Marky!" Eleanor cried out, her voice instantly reverting to the pathetic, breathless sob. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. Nora came into my room earlier and threatened me. She told me if I didn't leave, she'd make sure I ended up in a state asylum. I've been trembling for hours." Mark stood up slowly, turning to face his mother. The weeping boy vanished, replaced by a man whose face was masked in an icy, terrifying stillness. He looked at Eleanor, then at Chloe, who was already opening her mouth to join the accusation. "Get out," Mark said, his voice quiet, but carrying a resonance that made everyone in the room freeze. "Marky, what are you saying?" Eleanor gasped, her eyes widening in theatrical horror. She reached out a trembling hand toward him. "You can't can't believe her. She's trying to poison you against me. Look at me, I'm your mother. I said, get out, Mark repeated, his voice dropping an octave, terrifyingly steady. He stepped forward, placing himself firmly between his mother and our daughter, Maya, who had shrunk back against my legs, sensing the explosive tension in the room. My mother, sensing the danger instantly, quietly took Maya's hand and guided her out to the front porch, closing the door behind them to protect her from the fallout. Chloe stepped forward, her face contorting into an aggressive snarl. Mark, have you lost your mind? You can't talk to her like that. She's a sick old woman. If you kick her out, I will make sure the entire family knows exactly what kind of monster you are. I'll post the truth on every platform. You'll be ruined! Mark reached onto the dining table, picked up my phone, and pressed play on the speaker. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence as Eleanor's clear, mocking voice filled the space. He's completely wrapped around my finger, Chloe. He'd throw that stuck-up bitch out on her ear if I asked him to. By the time we're done, Mark will file for divorce, you'll get the cottage, and we'll take half the equity. The recording played for 20 agonizing seconds before Mark cut it off. Chloe's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The arrogant confidence she had carried all morning evaporated, replaced by a pale, sickly panic. Eleanor didn't flinch. The frail, trembling act dropped completely. Her posture straightened in the wheelchair, and her expression turned into something cold, venomous, and entirely predatory. You think you're so clever, don't you, Nora? Eleanor spat, ignoring Mark entirely and locking her eyes onto mine. You think a little recording changes anything? Mark signed the care agreement. Legally, I have a right to be here. You can't just throw me out on the street without a formal eviction process. And by the time that happens, I'll have dragged your names through so much mud you won't be able to show your faces in this town. I stepped forward, matching her icy gaze, refusing to let her see an ounce of fear. The care agreement Mark signed used joint marital funds without my signature or consent, Eleanor. My attorney has already verified that it constitutes financial fraud against the marriage. It is legally null and void. More importantly, you don't receive mail here yet. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. If you and Chloe are not off this property by tomorrow morning, I am filing for an immediate civil restraining order based on harassment and attempted extortion, backed by this audio recording. You wouldn't dare, Chloe hissed, though her voice lacked conviction. Try me, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. If you think your little Facebook post can survive the public release of this audio file showing you plotting to defraud a family and strip equity from a child's home, go ahead and post it. Let's see how your aunts, your employers, and your friends feel when they hear the real Eleanor and Chloe. Chloe looked at Eleanor, the panic turning into full-blown terror. She knew she was beaten. Her reputation, her career, her entire social standing would be annihilated the moment that recording went public. Come on, Mom, Chloe muttered, grabbing the handles of Eleanor's wheelchair. We're leaving. This place is toxic anyway. Let them have their miserable little house. Eleanor didn't say a word as Chloe wheeled her toward the back door. But as they reached the threshold, Eleanor turned her head back to look at Mark. Her eyes were dead, devoid of any maternal warmth. You were always a weak, pathetic little boy, Mark. You were a mistake the day you were born, and you're a coward today. Don't you ever call me again. The door slammed shut behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stood in the center of the kitchen, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his head bowed. The words of his mother had landed like physical blows, reopening every single wound he had spent a lifetime trying to heal. He looked so incredibly small in that moment. I wanted to reach out to him. I wanted to hold him and tell him it was over. But as I looked at the empty spaces where my studio used to be and thought about the absolute disregard he had shown for my life, my consent, and our partnership just 24 hours ago, a cold wall of emotional exhaustion rose up inside me. He had saved us at the final hour, yes, but only after he had brought the fire down upon our heads. Mark slowly looked up at me, his eyes hollow, tears tracking down his face. Nora, I am so sorry. I didn't see it. I was so blind. You were, I said, my voice quiet, devoid of anger but heavy with a profound sadness. You chose her over me, Mark. You chose her over our daughter's stability. You dismantled my life to feed a ghost. Can we fix this? He whispered, reaching a hand out toward me, his voice trembling. Please, Nora, don't leave me. I looked at his outstretched hand, then out the window at the empty cottage. The immediate danger was gone, but the foundation of our marriage was cracked, and I didn't know if we had enough mortar left to rebuild it. The process of reclaiming my life didn't happen overnight. It began the next morning with the physical labor of restoration. Mark spent the entire day, nearly 12 straight hours without a break, moving my drafting tables, my flat files, my canvases, and my archives back out of the storage unit and into the cottage. I stood in the doorway, watching him carry the heavy oak furniture across the gravel path. His face was etched with a quiet, punishing exhaustion, but he didn't complain once. It was his penance, and we both knew it. But moving the furniture back didn't wash away the smell of cheap lavender and stale betrayal that still lingered in the air. It took weeks of leaving the windows open, of deep scrubbing, and of slowly reintroducing my own life into the space before it felt like mine again. The social fallout from the family was swift, but not in the way Chloe had planned. Mark, in a rare moment of absolute courage, sent the audio recording to a private family group chat containing his aunts, uncles, and cousins, accompanied by a simple message. This is the reality of what Nora and I were dealing with. Eleanor and Chloe are no longer welcome in our lives. Please respect our privacy as we heal our family. The public Facebook posts vanished within an hour. The flying implementation of extended family ceased immediately, replaced by a a stunned, embarrassed silence from those who had championed Eleanor's return. Our marriage, however, remains in a state of careful, fragile reconstruction. We didn't file for divorce, but the easy, unthinking trust we once shared is gone. We started intensive couples therapy 2 weeks after the incident. In those sessions, I had to voice the hard, ugly truths, that I looked at him differently now, that I saw him as someone capable of betraying me under the right psychological pressure. Mark has had to face the grueling work of mourning a mother who never truly existed, while simultaneously earning back the right to be my partner. We sleep in the same bed, but there is an invisible ledger that sits between us, waiting to see if his future actions can balance the debt of his past choices. Maya is back home, her laughter once again filling the courtyard. She knows her grandmother went back to Phoenix because she felt better, a gentle white lie we agreed on to protect her innocent world. Watching her draw at the small table I set up for her in my restored studio brings a bittersweet warmth to my chest. Looking back on those 3 days of madness, I realized that the true danger of toxic family dynamics isn't just the overt cruelty. It's the way they demand that everyone around them become a casualty to sustain their illusions. I spent years thinking that being a good wife meant unconditional support, even when my partner was spiraling into his past. I learned the hard way that true emotional intelligence requires boundaries that are absolute and unyielding. I don't regret refusing to leave my house. I don't regret the recording. And I don't regret the cold, hard ultimatum I delivered. Standing your ground against the people you love is the hardest thing a woman can do. But sometimes protecting your sanctuary means refusing to let the people who broke their own homes burn yours down for warmth. We are surviving, we are rebuilding, but we are doing it on my terms now. And that is the only way forward.